So, we're live. This is Whiteflame. I'm here with Miss Bailey. We're both members of the debate.org community, and we're both involved in this live debate tournament that Bish One started, and I think we both appreciate very much the opportunity to debate these things live, much as online debates are good. I think that there's a lot of utility to being able to do these in a sort of face-to-face fashion. Face-to-face means avatar to avatar. In any case, looking forward to this debate. It's on animal experimentation, animal testing. The pro, who is Miss Bailey, will be arguing for a ban on animal testing, whereas I, as Khan, will be arguing for against a ban on animal testing. And she will start off the debate. The idea is that we will have two speeches, each 7 minutes, followed by a 3-minute cross-examination section, then another 2 speeches of 7 minutes, another 3 minutes of cross-examination, and 2 5-minute speeches to cap it off. So I'll let her begin whenever she is ready.
Fantastic. Before I start, I'd like to thank Whiteflame for participating and Bish for hosting. Without further ado, here's my case. Firstly, animals are very different from humans. The most common animals used for testing, mice, fish, rats, rabbits, etc., are not even similar to people in terms of anatomic and cellular design, making them poor subjects. For example, in October 2004, the arthritis treatment Vioxx was recalled after causing over 27,000 heart attacks. Prior to having it released to the public, it was tested on mice. Despite the result it had on humans, it had no negative effects on mice. Even with our closest genetic relatives, the chimpanzee, there are problems. For instance, in studies of HIV, all of the potential vaccines were successful in chimpanzees, while they either failed or, in one case, increasing a human's chance of HIV infection. These cases prove that animal testing isn't always the best route to take, especially when it can potentially harm people in the long run. As well as posing a risk to humans, animal testing also greatly harms the animals involved. According to the Humane Society International, it is common for animals to be deprived of water and food, restrained for long periods of time, forced chemical exposure, burned, genetically manipulated with, and kept in close quarters within each other, which can be psychologically damaging as well as physically damaging. Another detail that makes this even worse is that animals can't consent while people can. They can't possibly agree to the terms of the experiment while people do have that chance. So, is it really worth risking the lives of 115 million animals yearly for the sake of science? Is it really morally just to inflict this unnecessary abuse to animals, even when they can verbally communicate their discomfort? If so, why isn't this acceptable to do to humans? With that, we can conclude that animal testing is ineffective due to differences in humans and animals, and it is cruel to the subjects. I rest my case.
All right. Thank you. And I will start my speech shortly. Just let me get very quickly organized. Okay. So now I will start in 3, 2, 1. Thanks, Miss Bailey. I really appreciate her willingness to debate this with me. I think it's a really interesting topic, and there's a lot of meat to it. With that, I'll get started. The main question we have to ask ourselves in this debate is not whether or not this specific method, whether or not medical testing in general is a problem, but whether or not this specific method of medical testing is a problem. Whether we should be doing this in animals or we should be doing this in by another means. Unless my opponent is advocating that we stop all drug production and all biological production that normally goes through these avenues. She is clearly supporting some form of movement forward that will involve some other means of testing. And so we have to compare this means of testing with all other forms. So there are a number of different possibilities. One of the first we could consider is in vitro testing. This is done in a test tube. The idea is that you have a certain number of cells or something that you can test in a very defined area with a defined solution. It works very well as an early stage, like, does this hurt or help a certain cell type? The problem is that it doesn't test systems, and human beings are fundamentally a system, as are all animals. We need that system in order to determine whether or not there are subsequent effects to other cell types or to other pieces of the system as a whole. In vitro tests fundamentally cannot do that. No matter the cell type you use, no matter how structured it is impossible to test the entire system with in vitro. Therefore, that one's out. So now we look at some other ones. Another possibility is simulations, the idea of putting this into a computer and sort of building a simulation online that we can test certain drugs with. The problem with this is that while these are becoming more advanced, they all fundamentally depend on what we already know about these systems. And we have to program it in with the idea being that we have all that knowledge in place and are capable of testing every single possible observation of interaction without actual experimental evidence. I think that's ridiculous. I think it's a great idea for after you developed an experimental system and worked with it in animals for an extremely long time and understand every in and out of how that animal or human function, but it doesn't work as a system until we're able to develop that perfection, because the only thing we can do then is test known interactions, which we should already have on the basis of what we know about the drug, even through in vitro testing. So that just leaves the last possibility, which is that we test in humans. This appears to be what my opponent is advocating for, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What we're talking about here is not just doing clinical trials. Clinical trials are already done in humans. We do them all the time in humans. And in the case of Vioxx, by the way, trials were done with large subsets of the population. The problem is when it was released to millions of people, then there were heart disease issues. That was an issue of numbers of patients rather than any sort of problem with the actual clinical trials. But in any case, we do test in humans. What we do with animals is what we call preclinical trials. It's the phase right before we do the first clinical trial. And what we're establishing is a death concentration, a certain amount that will actually cause a person to be injured heavily or die. So this isn't meant to test whether or not individual problems would occur or certain instances of certain disease would occur. We're talking about just generally knowing when a significant portion of animals would die under the strain of a given drug or biologic. That's what we're preventing here. And much as my opponent says that humans can consent, there's no means for consenting to this, because there's no means for understanding the risk that a human is under without having some sort of pretest, which is what animals are used to do. So unless my opponent is advocating that humans should be subject to the same subset of tests as are animals without the ability to consent, she is fundamentally doing the exact same harm as she's doing to animals in trying to do this through humans. But generally, this argument doesn't work on a number of different levels. For one thing, even if we assume there's some form of consent, the only people who would consent to putting their bodies at such tremendous risk are the poor, and only when they're afforded a huge amount of money in order to get in. So what she's buying into is a system of absolute classism that basically pushes human beings into that role based on their ability to survive using the fundamental tenets of a of society, their jobs, their ability to work, whatever it might be. She's putting those people at the most risk by replacing them in this system. But generally, we should understand that while animals aren't going to be a great system, they are at least a system, and they are at least comparable. Are they going to be perfect? No, but nothing is. No system is going to be absolutely perfect. It's the reason we spend billions on animal research a year. It's the reason we make sure to do this. Lastly, all the harm she cites about how it harms animals and does damage to a significant portion of animals, 115 million, she said. That doesn't mean that we throw out the baby with the bathwater. We don't treat the system itself as problematic. We treat the abuses of the system as problematic. We should ensure that these animals have a decent style of life, that they do not suffer, and that the minimum amount of harm can come to them. These are lab-bred animals, so they're not like captured from the wild or anything, and they're necessary for testing, especially when they're genetically altered in order to test very specific conditions. But they are necessary for that. That doesn't mean we should ignore the harms that they suffer, but it does mean that we should tackle the problem differently. All right, that's what I got. So how about you start us off with a question? You can ask me a question and I'll answer it, and then we'll go back and forth like that. And once again, I'll time it at 3 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Are you aware of the National Welfare Act and the violations that it brings in regards to animal testing?
I'm not specifically aware, no.
Okay.
You're welcome to bring that up in your next round.
Okay.
In any case, would you say that animals are, would you say there is an alternative to animal testing that is better?
I would say testing on humans, preferably.
Despite the fact that humans are animals?
Yes, despite that fact.
Okay. Next question?
I don't have any other questions.
Okay. So, would you say there are absolutely no ways to improve the animal testing process?
I would say that there are, but it would require them actually following the Animal Welfare Act, which I'll get into in my rebuttal, and it would require just overall being more humane, which I mentioned.
So if they can follow the Animal Welfare Act, you would find that that is a sufficient reason to continue doing animal testing.
If they could follow the Animal Welfare Act and they could ensure the effectiveness of animal testing, then yes.
Okay. Let's see. Would you say a person can consent to all harms of all unknown harms of a drug?
I would say that they can't consent to unknown harms. However, they should be made aware that they might be subject to the unknown harms.
Yes, but if they can't consent to them, how does that improve their ability to consent?
I am not aware.
Is consent your main problem with animal testing?
Not my main problem.
What is your main problem with animal testing?
My main problem is that they cannot ensure the effectiveness that animal testing would be the exact same, testing the drugs and all the clinical trials, that they would be the exact same on humans. For example, Vioxx.
Considering your example of Vioxx, though, that was run through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials in humans. It passed all 3. Would you say that that's an example of how even human testing can be flawed?
Yes, I would say that.
So why specifically animal testing should go away while human testing should remain?
Because there are plenty more examples of it being ineffective. Like I mentioned, HIV. The HIV infections and the vaccines test on chimpanzees and humans, and you cannot ensure that an animal will be the exact same on humans.
Okay, that's fine. So whenever you're ready, you can start your second round.
Fantastic. I'm doing rebuttals.
Rebuttals, building, whatever.
Okay, so in terms of what you said regarding um, consent, humans technically, yes, they can consent, and yes, they are consenting to unknown harms, and I would agree about the whole class and the poor being able to consent. However, they still can communicate that they will consent. Animals, however, can't. I have made this clear, but I'm going to go more in depth about it. Humans can ensure that if they want, they can be put through this, while animals are basically forced to do it. Even though humans are being put through unknown harms, they can still say they want to do it. They are aware that there are unknown harms. However, animals aren't, obviously. And regarding the Animal Welfare Act and what you said about it being more humane, there are acts to try to make it more humane in regards to getting proper nutrients, proper spacing, treating them overall, not being cruel. However, like I said before in the cross-examination, 94% of animal tests violates the Animal Welfare Act, which attempts to make tests humane and make it so that there isn't abuse and cruelty. However, if you look at all the cruelty that animals face, then you will see it is agonizing, because just imagine humans having to go through this in human testing. It is avoidable to do it in animal testing, however, they don't follow it. And that is all I have.
Okay, cool. So now I'll get started with my second round, starting now. So I'm going to address her rebuttals real quick, and then I'll get into a couple more expansions on my case. So she talks about consent. And she talks about the ability to enter into it versus the ability to be forced into it. I'm saying there are a couple of responses. First of all, she's not really responsive to my economic scenario, where I'm talking about the poor being essentially conscribed into this. What they're doing is they're saying, well, I mean, look at it this way. So someone who enters into phase 1 clinical trials is going to get paid a lot more than someone who enters into phase 3. The reason why is because that early on in the phase testing, they are at more risk. There are a lot more unknowns, but they are at least given a set of knowns that are very clear, and they understand how the harms have affected various animals. At least that gives them a baseline to understand what harms they're going to face. Now, what Pro is talking about is removing that baseline. When she does that, we're going to see that increase go exponential. So they're going to be required to pay out far more to patients who go into that system. What that means is several things. First of all, it means that the poor are going to be most likely to take these on, because it basically makes it possible for many of them who currently don't have the means to survive. So those people aren't having a choice. They're conscripted into it by their economic means. So the idea that there's some form of consent going on here just because they can speak and understand is ridiculous. They are basically chained to the money that they're giving through this program. The only difference between them and the animals in this case is which kind of cage they're in. So the second problem is that if they are going to pay out that tremendous amount, we're talking about having a much bigger increase on development costs. So you're talking about a drug which right now it costs roughly $1 billion to bring a drug to market. This amount of money. And yet Pro is advocating increasing the upfront costs of doing this. Now, the motto for organizations that that make these drugs is fail early, fail fast. But if we have those huge costs up front, then that means that companies are going to have to pay out more with each drug. And that means that they are going to pursue fewer and fewer tests. Now, Pro doesn't actually talk about this, but she sort of concedes that there's a need for drug development. It's necessary to pursue especially truly novel substances, which are untested in humans as a whole. And those substances would engender the highest risk and thus have the highest cost associated with developing them if humans are the first target that they have to be developed in. So what she's doing is essentially shoving all truly novel substances off the table and saying that the only things we will pursue are things that are currently known to not be a huge danger to humanity in order to reduce the amount of harm that they're causing to these people, such that they can charge a little less to put them through preclinical trials. It's still going to be a lot of money, but they're basically not going to produce as much new novel drugs, which means all sorts of disease, all manner of diseases that go on, basically continue to go on at the same rate without any means of treatment. And the second argument she makes is that animal testing violates, 94% of animal testing violates the Animal Welfare Act. Fine. We will require that all animal testing follow the Animal Welfare Act. All that we can do on that is we can make it fully enforceable, which means the government will require it, which means on every single research grant, every single process, part of the process, they are required to follow that and be followed on that. The FDA already regulates a lot of these drug products and the processes by which they're made. All you do is make the FDA able to enforce the Animal Welfare Act, and you're solved on this. She doesn't provide anything that the Animal Welfare Act doesn't cover in terms of harms to animals. So we can do that and continue animal testing, even if it's at a lesser level. And even if it's a little more expensive, it's still not nearly as expensive as the alternative she's suggesting, and it's still a whole lot better. The only other major point she's made throughout this is just that animal testing doesn't produce results often enough. Well, I showed through the example of Vioxx that humans don't always produce the correct answers either, regardless. So the problem is about meeting certain genetic requirements, because certain genetics aren't always apparent in all animals. So this makes it really important to have very specific genetics that you're testing for across a single species, especially if you want to test a lot of drugs. You need an animal that is going to reproduce a ton in a short period of time and have that genetic variability that you can test a whole lot of drugs with. Animals that do that are mice and rats. That's the perfect animal to test with. That's why we use them in like 90% of all tests. So we can shove everything else off the table and just talk about them. They're extremely important towards the development of literally every drug, because they make the pace of drug development so much faster. Without that generation time, if we had to do this in humans, think of the numbers of humans we'd have to do to match that 115 million animals, most of which are composed of rats and mice. That is completely absent in a human population. It would be practically genocide to think about that as a human population that we would actually do that to. So we have to do it with a population that's lab grown, can be actually produced in mass. And by the way, these mice and rats in most cases wouldn't exist regardless. So the lab environment actually makes it possible for them to live. Now we could talk about whether the quality of life is any good, but the reality is that that is a very important, that we provide the capacity for their ability to exist. And so that shouldn't necessarily be tossed out either. So at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what is drug development doing for us, and what is the alternative doing for us? The alternatives don't work, and drug development is far too important to ignore. All right, so I guess I'll start this round of questions. Another 3 minutes. Enforce the Animal Welfare Act. Why can't we enforce the Animal Welfare Act? Why isn't it enforced?
I am not aware why it is not enforced. but the FDA hasn't done too much to push it, and the government hasn't done too much to push it. I agree that they could do that, but I'm not sure how you could make it fully enforced to make sure that every single laboratory would be able to follow it. That's my problem with animal testing and the cruelty it faces, mostly.
Okay. You have any questions?
Yes. You would agree that if it were to produce proper science, then the amount of money spent would be okay.
Yes. The amount of money spent, as long as they actually produce new drugs and new things that are actually beneficial to humanity, yes. As long as
Okay,
the expense is actually paid out.
great.
So you, and one thing that I'm having trouble with. So why don't research papers suffice as a means of knowing whether or not someone is actually using the Animal Welfare Act, following the Animal Welfare Act? Don't they have to publish that?
They don't have to publish it, as far as I'm aware. If they don't have to publish the quality of life, which makes it even worse when deciding whether or not they made the quality of life for the animals at least tolerable so that they could live, as far as I'm aware.
Okay. Any other questions?
I don't. What about you?
No, I think I got it. Okay.
Okay,
So how about you start your final round then? 5 minutes?
great. Like I was saying in my cross-examination, if it were to pay the money, well, if the money was well spent, then effective science would be in order. Um, however, animals still aren't perfect. I do agree that humans aren't perfect either, but they are the best for subjects because when making drugs for humans, you would think that you would use humans as an example. It's just common sense to use the species that you're making a drug for with that. So that is the most effective option that we could come up with. And I have a problem with Khan's um, assumption that the poor are forced into it because of their economic status. However, they aren't technically forced. The poor could go about other means of making money, while animals, of course, they don't have a choice in these experiments, which I've been pushing throughout all of this. The poor have other means of making money. They don't have to accept these trials. They don't have to accept this way of making money. However, they do anyway. And I would like to ask, how are they going to regulate the Animal Welfare Act as to where it was enforced in every single experiment, in which every single laboratory followed it, so that it would be humane and uncruel, unlike it is now, in which millions of animals in laboratories die worldwide. And that's all I have.
All right. So I'll get started with mine. 3, 2, 1. Thanks again to Miss Bailey. I really appreciate this debate, and I think it's been fun. I enjoyed it. So for the main things I want to emphasize in this final round are what's actually going on here. So when we're talking about this, when we're talking about the issue of where money should be spent and who and what whether animals are a more effective system or whatever, we should understand how the system works. I explained this in my first round. When you start with early biochemical tests, often in vitro. You move on to a secondary test in preclinical trials. That's when you use animals. And then subsequent to that, you have 3 different phases of human testing. All 3 phases of human testing occur for every single drug that goes through. That includes Vioxx. That includes all the HIV vaccines. That includes everything. What preclinical trials are is a gateway. They tell you whether or not a given drug is safe to use and at what doses it is safe to use. They tell us whether or not humans could feasibly take it without keeling over or suffering major, horrendous problems. Let's go back through what my opponent said in this final round. She said that should money be spent well, we could still produce a lot of different drugs. This is fundamentally misunderstanding my argument. What I said was, since this requires humans, since this requires a shift to humans, it would require an exponential increase in what we pay them. That means spending many, many millions more just to get through preclinical trials, which companies will not be willing to do with anything that's untested. And the untested products are what solve our disease burden. They're what make it possible for us to produce new drugs and for those drugs to be effective against all manner of heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, any manner of diseases that we do not have solutions for in status quo, fundamentally shutting us away from. And that's the big problem. Using humans in preclinical trials is not going to manage that. But more importantly, and this goes on to a response on the poor people are desperate. Understanding that is really important here, because the idea that they can just make money in other locations is ridiculous. Not everyone can. Often they are in really disadvantaged positions where they don't have a roof over their head, they don't have access to food. They can't just go down the street and hope to get a job from their local McDonald's, especially during an economic downturn. There's a lot of desperation out there, a lot of people who are suffering. Pro doesn't seem to disbelieve that it's mostly poor people in this, so she's buying my major link here, even if you're thinking, oh, well, there is at least some choice on their aspect. That doesn't mean that they're consenting. At no stage in this are they consenting, and that is key. When they cannot consent, and Pro concedes this in the previous round, when they cannot consent to the harms that they face, which they cannot do unless they know what those harms are, there is no reason to believe that they have freedom of choice here. They are being forced into it by other factors, in this case, economic. So lastly, she talks about how to regulate the Animal Welfare Act. I mentioned in the previous round that the FDA does this, and I can go into a little more detail on what the FDA specifically does. The FDA makes sure that you can move on from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, also from preclinical trials to phase 1. So the FDA gets to review every single case that comes through. If someone defrauds them, i.e. keeps this information off their books, then yes, it becomes a big problem. But the FDA does have the capacity to regulate every single one that is actually presenting that info. And if they do go against it, if they do decide not to present that information, then the FDA has the right to basically shut them down and majorly fine them, which is a big problem for them, and a lot of companies aren't willing to risk that. Now, whether this will affect all forms of research, it's hard to say, but we can at least improve regulation. We can make sure that the NIH has a granting system that ensures that people are following the Animal Welfare Act. The NSF should do the same. A whole bunch of granting systems should ensure that they are the gateway to make sure that good, reliable, ethical animal testing occurs. And the only way we can do that is if we keep animal testing around and ensure that these drugs are continuously improved. All right. I'm going to stop the